Hi, and welcome to this video introducing the Norwegian language. I'm Adam, and I'll be your teacher. Norwegian is spoken by about 5 million people. It is the primary official language of Norway and spoken by about 90% of the population as a first language. Geographically, it's the majority language in all of Norway, with the exception of 2 municipalities in the north, where this position is instead held by North Sami. Norwegian is, however, the common language of Norway and is spoken and understood by the entire population. The Norwegian alphabet consists of the Latin alphabet, with 3 extra letters attached at the end, and is identical to the Danish alphabet, with which it is also related. The extra letters are proper letters in their own right, and are not regarded as variations of A, E, O, or A, as you can see and hear in words such as stare, skvære, stor, stør, and lag, låg. Now, a very distinguishing feature of Norwegian, and one of the most important things to learn about, is that Norwegian actually has 2 official written standards. That's right, and I'm not talking about 2 different languages here, but 2 standardized and official ways of writing the same language. It's not a very common thing to do, so I can understand if this might seem puzzling to you. Anyway, the names of these 2 language forms are nynorsk and bokmål. The original meanings of these names are modern Norwegian and book language, respectively, but today the names are completely standalone, and nobody really cares about what they originally referred to. Also, I want to reiterate that these are different written forms of the same language and that nobody speaks them. The language is simply Norwegian, no matter how you write it. Anyway, to get a better grip on this situation, let's look at some history. In 1537, shortly after the collapse of the Kalmar Union, Norwegian sovereignty was effectively ended and the country became a province of Denmark. This led to a complete stop in the writing of Norwegian, which until then had had quite a rich literary tradition, and instead writing was done only in Danish. Then, in 1814, after the Napoleonic Wars, Norway declared its independence, and with a newfound sense of nationalism, people started to think about, not writing in Danish anymore. But then Sweden came along and forced Norway into a union, and then the Norwegians were like, oh well, at least it's not Swedish, and so they kept writing in Danish. But the question remained, and all throughout the 19th century, there was a hot debate on how to actually implement a written Norwegian language. And this is where the entire thing starts, because there were 2 camps, with different ideas on how to actually do this. On the one hand, you had the opinion, let's not break with tradition, and the language people already know how to write. Let's just make it more Norwegian, step by step, until it better represents how we actually speak. This position was mainly held by conservatives and by middle-class urban dwellers. And this makes sense since Norwegian and Danish are closely related to begin with, and since the spoken language of the urban upper classes had been significantly influenced by Danish and the Danish written language, and thus they wouldn't have to modify it all that much before it was a reasonable representation of their speech. Well, that and the fact that most people do tend to be quite conservative when it comes to language. Anyway, the other opinion was basically, well, screw this. Let's just get rid of everything and start over, and make a new written language based on how Norwegians actually speak. This position was advocated primarily by liberals and by non-urban dwellers. And this position makes sense too, since the spoken language outside of the major cities was generally so distant from the written language that it'd be way simpler to just make a new written language than try to fit the old Danish one onto it. And what happened then was that both of these movements prevailed. The Norwegianization of the Danish standard resulted in bokmål, and the creation of an entirely new Norwegian standard gave today's nynorsk. Strength-wise, bokmål has always had the advantage over nynorsk since it didn't start from zero, although up until the Second World War, the gap was closing rapidly, and in the 1940s, about a third of elementary school pupils were using nynorsk as their primary written form. But since nynorsk failed to get a foothold in the major urban areas, post-war urbanization and exclusion in mass media led to a decline in its use. Today, about 15% of the total population are users of nynorsk, and about 85% are users of bokmål. And when it comes to using the other variety, users of nynorsk are more likely to be proficient in bokmål than the other way around. As an example of the difference between the 2 language forms, here are some common words written in both of them, that you can also use when trying to identify what variety a text is written in. But remember that even though these words are different, there are also a whole lot of words that are completely identical in the 2 language forms. Geographically, bokmål is the official written form in 158 municipalities, primarily in eastern and northern Norway. Nynorsk is the official written form in 113 municipalities, primarily in western Norway. The remaining 157 municipalities are officially neutral, but in practice, bokmål tends to dominate in such places. We can also note that of the 20 largest municipalities, none use nynorsk as their official language form, regardless of location, which further reflects the historical status of bokmål in the urban areas. And here I want to make another thing clear, and that is that this municipal distribution of nynorsk and bokmål as official language forms does not necessarily correspond to the spoken language in these areas. In fact, neither variety is based on the speech of a specific region, and as you saw earlier, the geographic distribution of the two varieties hasn't always been the same either. Of course, the present distribution is not entirely coincidental either, but the relationship between the two written varieties and the spoken language is a complex issue, and we're probably better off saving this for another presentation. Anyway, let's talk about the spoken Norwegian language instead. Compared to most other Western languages, dialects in Norwegian have a very strong position and have not been streamlined or replaced to the same extent as those of many other languages of Europe. In theory, every dialect is equally valid and considered correct Norwegian, and there is no officially promoted standard spoken language. In practice, however, this can vary significantly. In general, urban dialects and varieties that take many elements from the written language often enjoy high covert prestige, especially in southeastern Norway. On the other hand, in many areas the local dialect enjoys equally high status, and speaking a dialect close to the written language might instead be considered conspicuous. The most prominent Norwegian dialect today is called Urban East Norwegian, and many people do consider this variety a kind of unofficial standard. This is essentially a kind of spoken bokmål, which traces its origins to Western Oslo and the prestigious Danish-Norwegian hybrid language once spoken there. This variety has spread and mixed with surrounding dialects, radiating out from Oslo, and is now the main dialect for many people living in this area. This form of spoken Norwegian is the one usually taught to foreigners and the one described in Norwegian grammars. But in learning or speaking Norwegian, you should nevertheless be prepared to encounter a lot of spoken and often even written variation. As for the dialects throughout Norway, these are traditionally divided into a western and an eastern branch, as you can see here. The most prominent feature of these two areas is the intonation, which in the western dialects is more leveled and falling, while in the eastern ones it's instead quite rising, and you'll be able to hear this difference in the samples later on. Anyway, there's also another four-way division of the Norwegian dialects. This division is more commonly seen today and also corresponds better to how Norwegians themselves perceive the various dialectal areas. Each of these groups have a set of defining characteristics, but there's also a lot of variation within each group, and all of them can of course be divided even further. But in any case, it's important to note that speakers of most dialects have little trouble understanding each other, and most people are also quite used to adapting their speech when encountering people speaking another variety. And if Norwegian hasn't struck you as unique thus far, it's time for yet another striking feature of the language, namely its optional forms and freedom of choice between them. It so happens that foreigners are not the only ones to question the use of having two written standards for the same language, and so during the first half of the 20th century, several attempts were made to bring them closer to each other with the ultimate goal of merging them into a single, common Norwegian written standard. But since bokmål and nynorsk is basically all I've been talking about so far, this obviously failed. But it did result in a number of new forms entering both varieties, with many of them being made optional, meaning that every person is free to choose whichever form they wish as long as they're being consistent. In bokmål, the optional forms usually represent a conflict between reintroduced Norwegian forms and original Danish forms, called radical or moderate, as we can see in these examples. Sju, kasta, and boka are radical, originally Norwegian forms, and syv, kastet, and boken are moderate, originally Danish forms. In nynorsk, optional forms instead usually represent different dialectal forms, and there's no historical opposition between them. Examples of this are væra and være, me and vi, and tenkjer and tenker. Relationship-wise, Norwegian belongs to the North Germanic languages of the Indo-European language family. This makes it closely related to languages such as Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic, more distantly related to languages like English, Dutch, and German, and very distantly related to languages like French, Spanish, Russian, Greek, and Hindi. Swedish and Danish are the closest relatives of Norwegian, and the three languages are generally considered to be mutually intelligible, meaning that speakers of these languages can use their own languages with each other and expect to be understood, especially if written. How well this works in practice varies a lot from person to person, but especially Norwegians and Swedes will tend to communicate with each other in their own languages, and Norwegian speakers are also better at understanding Swedish and Danish than the other way around, not unlikely because Norwegians are used to a lot of variation in their own language already. As an example of the similarity of the three Scandinavian languages, let's take the phrase "I've bought myself a new car," which in Eastern Norwegian is "Jeg har kjøpt meg en ny bil." And upon seeing this, there should be no wonder that these languages are intelligible to each other, right? Now, moving on to grammar, Norwegian nouns have no cases, but they do have three genders: masculine, feminine, or neuter. Although in moderate bokmål, the feminine gender is optional, and it's quite common to use the masculine forms instead, which is similar to how it works in Swedish and Danish. So in bokmål, we get en bil, ei bok, and ett hus, meaning a car, a book, and a house, respectively. Now, a peculiarity in the nouns is that the definite article is attached to the end of a word, instead of being independent, like English the. So, from the indefinite words just mentioned, we get the definite forms bilen, boka, and huset, meaning the car, the book, and the house, respectively. As for the verbs, there's no conjugation for person. So, for example, to live is lever in the present tense, levde in the past, and ha levd in the perfect, no matter what person is doing the living. This is unlike English, where you say, for example, I live, but she lives, and so on. And besides grammar, there's also an interesting thing to note about the pronunciation of Norwegian: the pitch accent. Simply put, this is a kind of tone contrast where a word can have either accent 1 or accent 2, and where this can change the meaning of a word entirely. So, for example, with the Eastern accent shown here, we have hender and hender, where the first means hands and the second means happens. Other such pairs are vatne and vatne, and bønner and bønner, which, despite the spelling, are otherwise identical in pronunciation. Alright, to round off, I'm gonna let you listen and read along to two texts in Norwegian. The first one is a passage from the 1991 novel Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder, written in moderate bokmål and read with a local accent by a native speaker from the Østfold region. The original title is Sofie's Verden, and it is an international bestseller, having been translated into 59 different languages.
Det triste at ikke bare tyngdeloven vi venner oss til etter hvert som vi vokser opp. Vi venner oss I samme slengen til hele verden som sådan. Det kan se ut som om vi I løpet av oppveksten mister evnen til å være forundret over verden. Men da mister vi noe vesentlig, noe filosofene prøver å vekke til liv igjen. For et sted inni oss det noe som sier at livet en stor gåte. Det noe vi en gang opplevde, lenge før vi hadde lært å tenke det.
The next passage is from the 1963 novel The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas, written in nynorsk and read with a local accent by a native speaker from the Sunnhordland region. Its original title is Isslottet, and it is considered a classic of Norwegian literature, being awarded the Nordic Council's Literature Prize in 1964.
Vintersola hadde omsider kommet så høyt at hun slapp ned til ispalasset. Den sene kalde sola hadde likevel mye av sin kraft. Strålene gikk gjennom tjukke isvegger og vinkler og brester, og brøt lyset I underfulle mønstre og farger, så det trøsteløse rommet dansa. Istappene ned fra taket, og de som vokser oppover fra gulvet, og selve dråpene, og alt danser med I dette lyshavet som brøt inn. Medan dråpene glimta og storkna, og gjorde for hver gang det vesle rommet en dråpe mindre.
And so, we're at the end of this presentation about the in many ways unique Norwegian language. Be sure to follow this channel for more videos about Norwegian and for introductions to other languages. Thank you for watching.
contact with European medieval learning, hagiography and history writing, merged with native oral tradition and Icelandic influence. This was to flower into an active period of literature production in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Major works of that period include Historia Norwegi, Fidrex Saga, and Konungsskuggsjá. The period from the 14th century to the 19th is considered a dark age in the nation's literature, though Norwegian-born writers such as Peder Klau and Friis and Ludvig Holberg contributed to the common literature of Denmark-Norway. With the advent of nationalism and the struggle for independence in the early 19th century, a new period of national literature emerged. In a flood of nationalistic romanticism, the Grateful emerged. Henrik Ibsen, Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, Alexander Kielland, and Jonas Lie. The dramatist Henrik Wergeland was the most influential author of the period, while the later works of Henrik Ibsen were to earn Norway a key place in Western European literature. Modernist literature was introduced to Norway through the literature of Knut Hamsun and Sigbjørn Obstfoder in the 1890s. In the 1930s, Emil Boysen, Gunnar Larsen, Håkon Bugmark, Rolf Enesson and Edith Oberg were among the Norwegian authors who experimented with prose modernism. The literature in the first years after the Second World War was characterized by a long series of documentary reports from people who had been in German custody, or who had participated in the resistance efforts during the occupation. In the 20th century, notable Norwegian writers include the two Nobel Prize-winning authors Knut Hamsun and Sigrid Undset. The period after 1965 represented a sharp expansion of market for Norwegian fiction, and the 1970s produced both politicization and empowerment of Norwegian authors. The 1980s has been labeled the fantasy decade in Norwegian literature. Part 1. Medieval Poetry. The earliest preserved examples of Old Norse literature are the Eddic poems, the oldest of which may have been composed in early 9th century Norway, drawing on the common Germanic tradition of alliterative verse. In the 9th century, the first instances of skaldic poetry also appear with the Skalds Bragi Boddason, J.O. LFR of Veneer and the court poets of Harald Fairhair. This tradition continued through the 10th century, with the major Norwegian poet being Eyvind Skaldespillia. By the late 10th century, the tradition of skaldic verse had increasingly moved to Iceland, and Norwegian rulers such as Eirik Hakansson and St. Olaf employed mostly Icelandic poets. Part 2. Medieval Prose. In pagan times, the runic alphabet was the only one used in Norway. The preserved inscriptions from that time are mostly short memorial dedications or magical formulas. One of the longest inscriptions is that on the 8th century Eggen stone, containing cryptic religious or magical allusions. Around the years 1000 to 1030, Christianity became established in Norway, bringing with it the Latin alphabet. The oldest preserved Norwegian prose works are from the mid-12th to 8th century. The earliest are Latin hagiographical and historical texts such as Passio the Acta Sanctorum in Celio, Historia Norwegi, and Historia de Antiquitate Regum Norwegiensium. At the end of the 12th century, historical writing expanded to the vernacular with Agripaf Norregskan Unga Sogan, followed by the legendary saga of St. Olaf and Fuxkina. Medieval Norwegian literature is closely tied with medieval Icelandic literature and considered together as Old Norse literature. The greatest Norse author of the 13th century was the Icelander Snorri Sturluson. He recorded Norse mythology in the form of the Prose Edda, a book of poetic language providing an important understanding of Norse culture prior to Christianity. He was also the author of the Heimskringla, a detailed history of the Norwegian kings that begins in the legendary Ynglinga saga and continues to document much of early Norwegian history. The period of common Old Norse literature continued up through the 13th century with Norwegian contributions such as Fidrex Saga and Konungsskuggsjá, but by the 14th century saga writing was no longer cultivated in Norway and Icelandic literature became increasingly isolated. 3. 400 Years of Darkness. Norwegian literature was virtually non-existent during the period of the Scandinavian Union and the subsequent Dano-Norwegian Union. 1387 to 1814. Gibson characterized this period as 400 years of darkness. During the period of union with Denmark, Danish replaced Norwegian. The university and cultural center of Denmark-Norway was Copenhagen, where young men went to study. The Reformation was imposed on Norway in 1537 and the Dano-Norwegian rules used it to also impose Danish culture. This was effected through the pulpit as well as through written records, as pastors were trained in Copenhagen. Thus, written Norwegian became closely related to Danish, causing the literature to become essentially Danish. Gedel Pedersen, circa 1490 to 1557. Was the first Lutheran bishop of Bergen and a man of broad humanistic views. His adopted son, Absalon Pedersen Bear, 1528 to 1575. Followed in his footsteps as a humanist and a nationalist, writing an important historical work concerning the Kingdom of Norway. 1567. Peder Klauenfries, 1545 to 1615, was also a humanist who both revived the Heimskringlet by translating it into the language of the period and wrote the first natural history of Norway as well as an important topographic study of Norway. The 17th century was a period of meager literary activity in Norway, but there were significant contributions. Petter Dass, 1647 to 1707, wrote Nordland's Trumpet, the Trumpet of Nordland, which described in graphic verse the landscape, mode of life, conditions and character of the northern Norwegian people. Two other authors merit mention. Dorothe Engelbrettsdotter, 1634 to 1713, was Norway's first recognized woman author who wrote powerful religious poetry. Her first work, Sialens Sangoffer, was published in 1678. Ta Offer was the second collected works and was published for the first time in 1685. Another gifted poet was Anders Abo, who translated the Psalms into Norwegian and composed the creation poem, Hexameron. Norway also contributed significantly to the joint literature of Denmark-Norway. One of the very first names in Danish literature, Peder Klauenfries, 1545 to 1614, was Norwegian-born. Other important Norwegian by birth Danish authors of the period included Ludvig Holberg, Bergen, 1684 to 1754, Christian Tullin, Christiania, 1728 to 1765, and Johan Herman Wessel, 1742 to 1785. Part 4, Rebirth. Two major events precipitated a major resurgence in Norwegian literature. In 1811, a Norwegian university was established in Christiania, later renamed Oslo. Seized by the spirit of revolution following the American and French revolutions, as well as brittling as a result of the forced separation from Denmark and subordination to Sweden subsequent to the Napoleonic Wars, Norwegians signed their first constitution in 1814. Virtually immediately, the cultural backwater that was Norway brought forth a series of strong authors recognized first in Scandinavia, and then worldwide. Henrik Wergeland is generally recognized as the father of a new Norwegian literature. The enthusiastic nationalism of Wergeland and his young following brought conflict with the establishment, which was unwilling to accept everything as good simply because it was Norwegian. This period also saw a collection of Norwegian folk tales by Peter Asbjørnsen and Bishop Jørgen Moe. This collection, which paralleled those by the brothers Grimm in Germany and Hans Christian Andersen in Denmark, captured an important overview of the folk culture of the mountains and fjords. At least as important in the creation of Norwegian literature was the effort to introduce a pure Norwegian language, based on the dialects spoken in the areas more isolated from capital, the terror of Asen. 1813 to 1898 was at the heart of this effort. Asen, a self-taught linguistic scholar and philologist, documented a written grammar and dictionary for the spoken Norwegian folk language, which became nynorsk in Norwegian. The speech of the country, as opposed to the official language largely imported from Denmark. Nynorsk is one of the two official written norms of the Norwegian language to this day. Part 5. National Romantic Period. By the late 19th century, in a flood of nationalistic romanticism, the grateful emerged Henrik Ibsen, Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, Alexander Kielland, and Jonas Lie. A unity of purpose pervades the whole period, creation of a national culture based on the almost forgotten and certainly neglected past, as well as celebration of the bond culture or Norwegian farm culture, the realism of Kielland. For example, Skipperverse gave way to the romantic and nationalistic spirit which swept Europe and rekindled the Norwegian interest in their glorious Viking past. For example, Ibsen's The Vikings at Helgeland, The Struggles of the Middle Ages. For example, Ibsen's Lady of Osterrad, Peasant Stories. For example, Bjørnson's A Happy Boy, and The Wonders of Myths and Folks Tales of the Mountains. For example, Ibsen's Peer Gynt and the Sea. For example, Lee's The Visionary. Part 6. Transition to Realism. Although a strong contributor to early Norwegian Romanticism, Henrik Ibsen is perhaps best known as an influential Norwegian playwright who was largely responsible for the popularity of modern realistic drama in Europe, with plays like The Wild Duck and A Doll's House. In this, he built on a theme first evident in Norway with plays like Bjørnson's En Fallet, A Bankruptcy. Part 7. Emigration Literature. Although a side note to the mainstream of Norwegian literature, the literature which documents the experience of Norwegian immigrants to America is as important as the Norwegian immigrants became to the growing America of the 19th century. 3 authors are recognized in this genre. Ole Rolvag wrote about immigrants, while Johan Boger and Ingeborg Flinhagen wrote about immigrants. Ole Rolvag, who immigrated to America, experienced life in the prairies, and rose to become professor of Norwegian at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, provided a strong record of the joys and pains of the immigrant in adapting to the harsh realities of and carving out a new life in a wild new country. Norwegian author Johan Boger provided a mirror image depicting the struggles and processes which led to the decisions to emigrate. Ingeborg Flinhagen, having 2 brothers and a sister in the United States, contemplated the emigrants' longing for home and their harsh struggle over there in a known collection of emigrant poems from 1935. Part 8. Modernism in Norway. Modernist literature was introduced to Norway through the literature of Nat Hansen and Sigurd Jornebst-Fulger in the 1890s. In the 1930s, Emil Boysen, Gunnar Larsen, Håkon Vagmark, Rolf Enesen and Edith Oberg were among the Norwegian authors who experimented with prose modernism. The books of the 1930s did not receive the same recognition as modernist works after the war. In 1947, Tarjei Vesaas published a poetry collection, Like an Og Net, that led to major debate about the shape and rhythm for Norwegian poetry. This evolved further in the 1950s. Rolf Jacobsen achieved recognition as a poet of modernistic style after the war. Christopher Updal was also recognized for his work. Part 9. The 20th Century. After the death of the great Forund Amalie Skram, a new period of Norwegian literature took place. The year 1905, when Norway was free from the union with Sweden, marks a new period in the history of Norwegian literature. In the 20th century, 3 Norwegian novelists won the Nobel Prize in Literature. The first was Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, whose prize reflected work of the previous century. The second was awarded Nat Hansen for the idealistic novel Markens Grodd. Growth of the Soil, 1917. In 1920, the third was Sigrid Undset for the trilogy of Kristin Lavransdatter and the 2 books of Olav Ordanen, in 1927. Nat Hansen was especially criticized because of his sympathy for National Samling, a Norwegian Nazi party, during the Second World War. Other important Norwegian writers included Trygve Gulbrandsen, Jens Bjørnboe, Agnar Mikkel, Olav Dunn, Gore Sandell, Kjartan Flogstad, Angar Borg, Axel Sandemos, Tarjei Vesaas, Lars Saabye Christensen, Kjell Skjoldsen, Johan Borgen, Dag Solstad, Herb Jorgosimo, John Foss, Hans Herb Jornswood, Jan Erik Vold, Roy Jacobsen, Bergljot Hobarek Hav, Hans E. Kink, Olav H. Hodge, Rolf Jacobsen, Gunvar Hofmo, Arnulf Overland, Sig Jornabstad, Olaf Bull, Arsmund Olafsson Vinch, Torelven, Torborg Nedrias, Stein Maren, Jank Jerstad, Georg Johannesson, Christopher Updal, Alorvar, Hadis Moran Vesaas, Sigrid Hole, Johan Fulkbidget, Hans Borley and Axel Jensen. Part 9, The 20th Century, Chapter 1, The Post-War Period, 1945 to 1965. The literature in the first years after the Second World War was characterized by a long series of documentary reports from people who had been in German custody, or who had participated in the resistance efforts during the occupation. The most famous among these were Lise Bersons, Fangy Ravensbrück, Odd Nansens, Fredag til Dag, From Day to Day, and the posthumously published Peter Mohn's Dagbok, Peter Mohn's Diary. Some years later, biographies of heroes of resistance, such as Fridtjof Semins, Shetlands Larsen, about Leif Andreas Larsen, and David Armin Hauorth's We Live, Historien om Jan van Alsrud. 9 Lives, The Story of Jan van Alsrud, became major publishing successes. Fiction of the period also centered on the war. Sigurd Evens Smås Englandsferien, published in English as A Boat for England, about a group of resistance fighters who were captured. Tarjei Vesaas symbolically addressed the war experience in Huset I Morkret, The House in the Dark. A significant portion of the post-war literature was concerned with the question of why some remained good Norwegian patriots while others, seemingly ordinary people, served the enemy. Examples of this include Sigurd Holt's Motvedmilplin from 1947, Kari Holt's Det Store Beiskelet, The Big Fork from 1949, and Axel Sandemoses Varoven, The Werewolf from 1958, which provides psychological explanations for collaboration. Poetry written during the war, which had either been broadcast from London or had circulated illegally, was published as collections in the spring of 1945 and enjoyed a popularity that Norwegian poetry has not seen before or since, in particular Arnulf Overland's Vi overlever We Survive Everything, and Nordahl Grieg's Frederiksen, Freedom, were well received. Some of those who were young during the war found that the traditional lyrical forms were insufficient to express horrors of war, atomic bombs and the emerging Cold War. Gunvar Hofmo, who was personally affected by the war, came with the remarkable collections Jeg vil hjem til menneskene, I Want to Go Home to the People, and Fra en annen virkelighet, From an Alternate Reality. Modernism appeared on a broad front in the Norwegian poetry of the 1950s. It impacted the lyrics produced by Tarjei Vesaas, Ernst Orwell, Astrid Tollefsen and Olavich Hodge. Among the younger poets, such as Astrid Hittené Andersen, Paul Breck, Hans Borley, Harald Sverdrup and Marie Takvin, free verse was the preferred form. Paul Breck was modernism's foremost advocate against traditionalists such as Arnulf Overland and Andre Björk in a wide-ranging debate about poetic forms which is recognized as the speaking in tongues debate. Georg Johannesen's first publication, Dikt Poetry, in 1959 introduced a new interest in political and social values that had not been particularly evident in the 1950s. At the same time, the well-established poet, Rolf Jacobson, espoused a more critical attitude to the consumer mentality and environmental destruction. In prose, first and foremost it was Jens Bjorn Boe who led the attack on the establishment in the 1950s. In Jonas and Den und Herd, The Evil Shepherd, he attacks the school and prison systems, arguing that there the government shows its authoritarian aspects particularly clearly. One of the highlights of 1950s prose literature is Johann Borgien's Mild trilogy. Borgen work is characterized by an experimental prose writing style, which can be seen in several short story collections as well as the experimental novel Jeg. From 1959. Another highlight of 1950s literature was two controversial novels by Agman Niklas about Ask Belfort, Lasso Runt Fru Luna, published in English as Lasso Around the Moon, and Sagen on Den Road Ruben, The Song of the Red Ruby. But as a result of legal intervention against the latter book, the pressure of the court case and surrounding controversy left Nicola reclusive, who published little thereafter. Axel Jensen was another fresh, new voice in the 1950s. In his debut novels, Ikaros and Line, a young protagonist comes to terms with non-socialistic members of the social democratic welfare state. Jensen also introduced a new theme in Norwegian literature with the publication of Ebb in 1965. This novel dealt with a future dystopia. Besides Johann Borgen, Tarjei Vesaas and Torborg Nedre has also achieved recognition as excellent short story writers. In 1953, Kjell Skjoldsen debuted with the short story collection Here at the Folder Jeg Deg Helt Hjem. From Now On I'll Walk You All the Way Home. He has since remained at short prose genre, and is today considered one of Norwegian literature's finest short story writers. Part 9, The 20th Century. Chapter 2, Political Awareness and Social Realism. 1965 to 1980. The period after 1965 represented a sharp expansion of market for Norwegian fiction. In 1965, Norway instituted a policy for purchasing new literature. The state committed to purchase 1,000 copies of each new title of Norwegian literature, conditioned on it meeting minimum standards. These were distributed among the country's libraries. This, combined with the creation of the book club, Bok Club and Nyboga, New Books, in 1976 produced increased vitality in the country's literary production. The 1970s produced both politicization and empowerment of Norwegian authors as a group as well as intellectuals in general. The Norwegian Authors Union became an arena for political struggle as well as the struggle for academic authors' rights. At one point the Authors Union split into two camps. Around the country the authors organized themselves in the regional authors organizations, and started a number of literary journals in which contributions by amateur writers were welcomed. Pro-Film would eventually become the most notable literary magazine. From 1965, it published the work of a number of young writers who would put their distinct mark on the literature of the period. The Pro-Film goal was to bring Norwegian literature abreast of European literature in general. To achieve this, they rebelled against the traditional psychological novel development. The question of the true identity for the modern state was called Dag Solstad contributed significantly to this late 1960s figure's modernism through his articles, essays and literary works. Poetry already exhibited a modernist style, which was prevalent through the 1950s and early 1960s. Traditionalists who still wrote in fixed stanza forms were out of favor. The younger poets targeted replacing the 1950s style symbolism, and Jan-Erik Vold was at the forefront of this insurgency. Pro-fill poetry introduced a new simplicity, concretism, and use of everyday language. Paul Breck was particularly noted for promoting modern European poetry, both as poet and critic. He argued for a renewal of Norwegian poetry and spread knowledge of foreign literature through translations of English modernist writers like T.S. Eliot. In the mid-1950s, Breck participated in the debate on lyrical form and opposed André Bjørk and Arnulf Overland in the so-called glossolalia debate. Among the established lyrists, Olavich Hord transitioned to modernistic and concretist poetry and enjoyed a renaissance, especially with his collection entitled Dropar in Ostervind, which inspired other, younger Norwegian poets, such as Jan-Erik Vold. After a short period, the pro-fill group went separate routes, as authors such as Dag Solstad, Espen Hartvard-Skjolm, and Tore Brestad turned to the newly formed Party Workers' Communist Party, Biden's Communist Party, or AKP, and become involved in formulating a new political program that based on the view that literature should serve the working people and their uprising against capitalism. Arild Assens Solstad's 1970 is a key novel to understanding the desire of the modern intellectual to connect with something larger and more realistic, the working people and a cause. There were few AKP authors, yet they managed to set a major part of the agenda for Norwegian fiction through much of the 1970s. Some authors began to write novels and poems in a language targeted so that people could recognize themselves, often known as social realism literature. Well-known works in this genre include Solstad's 25, Septemberplussen, Augustad's Sorda, Strike, and Hartvard-Skjolm's Historiens Kraftlinjer. Even though a minority wrote AKP-themed literature, there was a general willingness of the larger community of authors to support this literary focus. Besides the class struggle, there were two areas that were subject of serious literature: feminism and the struggle against the concentration of governmental power into a centralized government. The term feminist literature or women's literature was shifting during this period. While some believed that a special term for literature written for women by women about women's experiences were necessary, others were concerned that feminist literature served to place the female writers and readers outside the community, in an isolated cycle. Notwithstanding the debate, important contributions came from new, female authors about women's unsatisfactory role in the family and in society. Liv Kort Saus, Hvem bestemmer over Liv og Uni? Who decides for Liv and Uni? Is central to understanding the new woman's literature. Bjørkved contributed a long series of short story collections and the play To Actor for Fem Kvinner, To Acts for Five Women. Both Kort Saus and Vic's work stayed with the realistic tradition. Later Cecily Loveide and Eldred London created work with a more rebellious language representing a fresh genre of experimental work. Loveide's work is notably committed to finding a new language for a new female role. Part 9, The 20th Century. Chapter 3, Beyond Social Realism. 1980 to 2000. The decade of the 1980s was in many ways a response to the social realism in 1970s literature. In 1983, Kai Skagen published a polemical philosophical treatise titled Bazarov's Barn, Bazarov's Children, alluding to the Russian fictional novelist Eugene Bazarov, which reconciled the role of authors who had been on the periphery in the 1970s. Skagen advocated for a more individual-oriented and idealistic literature. Although it is uncertain whether this book created or reflected the transition, many of the 1970s authors shifted in new directions during the 1980s. Dag Solstad published 2 novels which were retrospectives on the Workers' Communist Party. Espen Harvard Sholm wrote a novel titled Drift, and Edvard Hoem authored Provertid. All these works focused on middle-aged men who live through the crises of life while struggling to find new footing. Similarly, Nutvaldt Borkeen's novels about the change of men's roles during the women's revolution in the 1970s reflected the new direction. The 1980s generated several major novels that develop a main theme over decades, are centered on a strong central character person and are built around a rural milieu or a local community of a not-too-distant past. Examples include Lars Saabye Christensen's Beatles, Tove Nilsen's Skyscraper and The Skyscraper Angels. Ingvar M. Bjornsen's White Niggers. Gudbrandsen's SD. Croy Trilogy, Helbjorg Osmos Tora Trilogy and Roy Jacobsen's Sire Herin. The 1980s have also been labeled the fantasy decade in Norwegian literature. A number of authors, including Jarten Flogstad, Marius Munson, Hans Herb Jornswood, Arild Nyquist, Jank Jersten and Ragnar Hovland produced works with magical, fantastical or improbable elements. Literature written for children and young people also included fantastic elements. Dorm Haugen is the most notable contributor to this genre. A large number of 1980s authors displayed a high degree of literary consciousness. Many of the new authors in this decade were formally educated in literature, philosophy and other academic subjects at the many schools or institutes for writers established throughout Norway. Many novels generated internal conflicts with the text itself or with other texts, and the protagonist was represented as a writer, scientist or artist. Jank Jerstad's Homo Falsus is perhaps the foremost of these 1980s meta-novels. Karen Moe's KYK/1984, another. All Robert Sund and Liv Nistad also produced works in this genre. Another consequence of more academically oriented authors was the large number of essay collections published in recent years. These often provide an author's interpretations of other authors or reflections on other forms of art. The period showed a rising interest in crime literature. John Michelet, Gunnar Starlesen, Kim Smage and Fredrik Skagen all were well appreciated by Norwegian readers. In the 1990s, female crime writers such as Karen Fossend and Holt had great success. The latter's works featured a female investigator. Interest in crime has in no way decreased since the turn of the millennium, and a number of writers have either specialized in crime or have alternated between crime and other prose. Jo Nesbø, Kurt Ost, Uni Lindell, Tom Igeland, Tom Christensen, Jorn Lear Horst, Stein Morten Lear and Kjell Oledal are among the authors in this category. A stream of translated crime, especially from Sweden and Britain, have influenced Norwegian authors of this genre. Another clear trend is an interest in biographies, especially of authors and artists. Many of the significant living writers during the 1980s have written one or more biographies of deceased artists or other colleagues. In addition, several significant biographies were written. The Fall of the Sun God, Nut Hansen, by Jorgen Haugen and Inge Sletten Coloween's Nut Hansen biography received great attention. There is a trend in these modern biographies, similar to today's cinema and unlike the past, to use source material of a private character. In poetry, Rolf Jacobsen's Anatomy sold almost 20,000 copies, and Harald Sverdrup's by Seth Soyadli was also very well received. Stein Maren, Torelven and Paul Helge Haugen also published significant collections of poetry during this decade. Jan Erik Vold wrote some of his most political poetry, reminiscent of the 1970s, during the 1990s. The new and emerging poetry shows great diversity. However, only the rare collection of poetry achieves substantial sales or circulation. Poetry can be said to be in a crisis state, unlike newer novels, which often are published in large quantities as the month's book for book clubs. theatre audiences show only moderate interest in new Norwegian plays. Hence, drama has been overshadowed by prose and poetry, with one exception. John Foss, through the 1990s and later, has achieved an international acclaim not enjoyed by any other Norwegian playwright since Ibsen. Special characters in this article were substituted with audio cues. They were denoted as follows: and, left and right parentheses. This recording is a derivative work from Wikipedia. For more information, to commission recordings like this, and to support the developer, please visit www.patreon.com/frogcast.
This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK. This is the BBC.
Thanks for downloading this episode of In Our Time. There's a reading list to go with it on our website, and you can get news about our programmes if you follow us on Twitter at BBC In Our Time. I hope you enjoyed the programmes. Hello. Henrik Ibsen's tragedies are among the most performed plays in the world, second only to those of Shakespeare. Among them, A Doll's House, The Wild Duck, Hedda Gabler and Ghosts. His characters aren't kings, princes or emperors, but bank managers, doctors, photographers, and above all their wives and daughters, often trapped in their roles in the new Norwegian bourgeoisie. The dramas largely take place in city rooms or landscapes, not castles, and explore topics that caused a sensation when first performed in the late 19th century and still provoke discussion today. Should a mother abandon her children? What if a husband infected his wife with syphilis? What if a woman has an affair with an older man who she suspects is her father? With me to discuss the works of Henrik Ibsen are Tore Rem, Professor of English Literature at the University of Oslo, Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, Professor of English and Theatre Studies and Tutorial Fellow, St Catherine's College at the University of Oxford, and Dinah Birch, Professor of English Literature and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Cultural Engagement at the University of Liverpool. Dinah Birch, Ibsen was born in 1828. What are the main points we need to know about his early life?
He was born in a port city, Skien, in southern Norway, and his family was initially really quite prosperous. So I think the first thing you need to know about Ibsen is that there was a fall from affluence. His father's business failed when he was 6-7 years old. The family had to move from their rather grand house to what was apparently quite a dilapidated summer house in Vanstrop, not very far from Skien, and they hid their poverty to some extent. That had a long-lasting impact on young Ibsen, that notion of a family secret, some sense of a family disgrace. He was no great shakes at school. There was no sense that he was a brilliant young person in the making. Left and became, when he was 16, an apprentice to an apothecary, and he worked in that profession for 6 years. Again, I think very important to his formation. He didn't begin with the burning ambition to be a literary man. That developed out of experiences that he had. A key experience was becoming a father, again in rather shameful circumstances.
He was 18.
That's right. And he fathered a child with a servant who was older than he was, 28. He supported the child financially, had very little contact with the boy. It was an important moment for him, that sense again of a life-changing event which was to some extent hidden. He went to Christiania, Oslo, as we now call it, with the initial aim of joining the university, training to be a doctor, but his interests in culture, literature and particularly drama, already developing. He published his first play, Cataline, which was a classical drama, and crucially a play on a Norwegian theme which was performed successfully. It wasn't hugely praised, but it was certainly very competent, and that was the door that opened into the theatrical profession.
What was the state of theatre in Norway at the time?
It was very national, that on the basis of the burial Malm, Ibsen was enabled to become a playwright in residence and acquired
Was the language
experience.
of the theatre Danish?
It was Danish with Norwegian inflections, but
Yeah.
yes, it was. It wasn't at that point enormously, as it were, European or international, though I don't think it was an entirely insular tradition. And Ibsen was reading and thinking, and from quite an early age, ambitious to shape that tradition.
I think you made the point in your notes, Diana, that there weren't many options. This was the option for culture. I mean, obviously there was a cinema, television,
Yeah.
but actually reading and then seeing it on the stage
Yeah.
was a big thing.
Certainly, if you think about the broader traditions of theatre in Europe and, of course, in America, as you say, no television, no cinema, theatre was enormously popular. And it was quite a varied genre. There was burlesque, there was melodrama, music hall. It was popular among people who weren't necessarily literate at all, and certainly not reading. I think one of the interesting things, and again important to Ibsen, was a very close connection between drama and fiction. Looking at the history of European drama, it's very striking how quickly the really successful novels found their way onto the stage. In Dickens' case, for instance, his novels were being dramatised before he had finished their serial production, so he didn't know how they were going to end, and the theatrical producers and directors had to invent an ending. So they were very spectacular productions, which were crowd pleasers. Scenic effects were very important. Music was very important. They were entertaining, but not without a serious side. They were engaging with large issues, melodrama, not the most sophisticated form of drama, but looking at issues of oppression, injustice, but not a genre for the middle class.
Tore Ram, what would he have seen or read from Norwegian literature or elsewhere? As a young man, a very young man, say about 22, what was going on that he would have taken in? Dana said he was I think you have said this would be agreed. He wanted to be a poet, he wrote poetry, we told very fine poetry. And what would he have read there? What would his influences?
Well, Norwegian literature was very much in its infancy, so there was little contemporary literature that he would have encountered. And I think if we'd asked him, he would have said nothing, or next to nothing, because he's a very good example of what Harold Bloom calls suffering from the anxiety of influence. He hides his tracks. But what we do know is that when
I don't quite get that.
He's a classic. He's an instance of a writer who seems to be very wary of hiding the people who have influenced him. So we know very little about what he actually read.
He doesn't want to acknowledge those.
Even later, when he all around Europe is being associated with Zola, for example, he would claim that he'd never read Zola.
But he had read Zola, so he's fibbing.
He probably had, but
that's interesting.
But he does, when he's confronted with that question later in life about what he'd read when he wrote Catiline, his first play, he said only Holberg and Oehlenschläger. And Holberg, of course, is a kind of the Scandinavian Molière, and so he definitely learned something about comic method, and it's central for the literary language as well, Holberg. Oehlenschläger was now a much more obscure figure who was a Danish tragedy writer, romantic writer very much. His contribution was that he returned to the sagas. So he started using the medieval material in the Norse Viking tradition.
When he went back there quite early he started to write essays, as I understand, for magazines on literature and on theatre. So he dived straight in as to what he wanted to do there. And at an extremely early age, it seems to me, he was put in charge of a theatre in Bergen, where over 6 years he was manager of the theatre, which put on 100 plays, and that has been said by all three of you as forming the basis of his expanding terrific knowledge of the techniques, how you put a play on, what happened. Is that right?
I think that's absolutely crucial to understanding him. I would like to add that he obviously also encountered Shakespeare and Schiller, and he read Kierkegaard, at least. It's impossible to understand Brand without seeing that he read Kierkegaard. But in Bergen, he had the amazing fortune of being called to this post at the age of 23.
Why was that?
To me, that is one of... I think there's a master narrative about Ibsen that says that he suffered at home, he was misunderstood, he left the country, he stayed away for 27 years, and was acknowledged, met modernity in Europe. But I'm certainly interested in what I would call the resources of the periphery. And what was happening at the time was that theatres as institutions were being established, and very much within this national movement. So Ole Bull, who was a famous violin virtuoso, wanted to found a national theatre in Bergen. And Ibsen had published or had produced a couple of plays, and at this young age he was asked to come with Bull to Bergen and start this theatre.
So having not been particularly bright at school, as Diana pointed out, he must have been a bit of a star at 23 to get his own theatre.
Clearly.
Something happened. What happened? Was it his articles or what?
I think it was partly the way he was central in that running this journal called Mannen, the Man. But also just having that first theatre success that Dinah mentioned. And then, what happens is that he is in charge of 122 productions during these 5-6 years when he's in Bergen. And he produces his own play, every year. And I think what I would add to what Dinah was saying is that what's so striking about this culture is that it's an import culture. It's translations dominate. The French hegemony is very strong in the theatre. So he encounters recent French, the great plays of the Paris stage very early on.
Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, what was it about Ibsen's work that was building? He began to have a big reputation in Norway quite early on, and he always had a big reputation. He rested on that and must have enjoyed it. This was a boost of confidence for him. What was it about? What drove that reputation in the first place?
Well, to pick up on Tore's point, it really is the case that he was influenced by the discovery of native tales, Norwegian folk legend, but also the sagas, so the Norse sagas. These were the great resources for an aspiring writer, and he really mined them. So he wrote 10 plays by the time he left Norway. He had written 10 plays. And some really significant long poems, some of them articulating kind of stance of the lone poet and aesthete, and sort of picking up again on this point about his sense of distance from contemporary events and wanting to maintain almost an aura of aloofness from local politics or local debates and controversies. So he already has his mind set on that idea that you need to build on your successes in your native country by really going abroad and distancing yourself and getting some perspective.
He moved from Bergen to Oslo, didn't he, and took over another theatre there?
Yes,
to
that's right.
Christiania, as it was called there. Yeah, took over another theatre there for another 6 or 7 years. So we're talking about 13 or 14 years of solid graft inside a theatre.
Yes, and that was really important and set him up for his further training, if you will, abroad. But he really learned about stagecraft. He really learned about blocking a play, and this is the period before you have the artistic vision of the director. You don't really get a director as we know it until around 1900. You have actor-managers, but even that is later than what's going on in Ibsen's time. And so you're doing everything in the theatre. You're really hands-on learning the craft. That's what he did, and it stood him in great stead.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? 14 years. And then in 1864 he left Norway. Why did he do that?
Well, he had the great thing to realize is that and this is partly his own fault, he sort of cultivated this narrative of the poor, beleaguered writer who wasn't supported by his own country. But in fact, he did have friends and support in Norway. He applied for travel grants. He applied for funding from the government. He was turned down on some occasions, but he did receive a grant from the government to go abroad to Germany, first to Rome, to learn about cultures abroad and to immerse himself. And that was really the idea, is that he had a sense, as many artists of the time did, that you had to go to those cultural centres.
Rome, and then it was a 2-year grant, wasn't it? He stayed for 27 years.
Well, yes, he stayed abroad. He loved to be abroad. And that again counters the narrative of a kind of inward-looking, provincial, writer. That's not the case at all. He really flourished on this kind of world stage.
But going abroad enabled him to write about home, as it did with many writers.
Yes, he really did. In his letters, he talks a lot about being consciously, trying to remove himself, to get some perspective, as he puts it. He needs to gain perspective through distance.
His great national play was and still is Peer Gynt. Did he write, I can't remember, did he write that when he was in Italy?
Yes, that was written in Rome, I think.
And a lot of the phrases are into the Norwegian language we understand, and it's still the great definer in many ways of Norway. It's its own saga, isn't it? It's part of the saga.
I mean, it's extraordinary because it's been done in many cultures, and each one will say, oh yes, this is the Chinese character in a nutshell, or oh yeah, this is, the Indian character in a nutshell. I mean, it is really extraordinary how that play speaks to so many different cultures.
But while he was abroad and in Munich, I didn't read much about what he did in Munich, but let's get on with writing. While he was abroad, he started to write what one of us called it 12 last great plays, and the sagas went that way, although they're imbued in Munich, and so on. And we get the plays that people know about, and most of all, they mostly know about The Doll's House, of which there have been almost 4,000 different productions since it, a trivial pursuit, since it was first produced. Why was it such a breakthrough play, Diana? And how old was he when he wrote it?
He was still relatively young, 1879, so still quite a young man. It was an enormously forceful and direct challenge to deeply embedded concepts of marriage, of the relation between the sexes, and of our responsibilities to each other. It had a huge impact. It was considered a shocking and outrageous production, but it was never ignored and made quite a stir.
Yeah, but let's get to the story so people who don't know. The woman who is the doll,
Nora.
was a doll, Nora in the doll's house, turns and decides that she is going to assert herself take off her costume, which is a bit before, and assert herself as a woman of independence. Not only that, she's going to leave her husband. Not only that, she's going to leave her children, and away we go. And it was all that was a great shock to audiences.
Absolutely.
And very great shocking when it came here. Yeah. Right, now then.
Yeah. So that point that you make about leaving the children, I think, is key. Leaving your husband is one thing, but then, as now, a married woman who leaves her children and leaves her children in the hands of a man who she herself has pronounced as inadequate for the role, that was an enormous shock. But going back to the points that have been made, I think they're key points about Ibsen's skills developed over many years as a dramatist. I think it's really important to register that this is not, as it were, a polemical rant. It's an extraordinarily powerful and skillfully plotted play. So it's full of dramatic tension. Nora and Torvald, her husband, are not the only characters. There's Krogstad, there's Christine. Krogstad, who disrupts Nora's hopes for a smooth transition to an affluent, perfect life because he has secret information about her forging a signature on a bond. So the play is full of dramatic tension, and the audience is gripped and really absorbed in the action to an extent that makes the terrific climax at the end of the play, this confrontation between Nora and Torvald, so exciting for the audience as well as so shocking. It's not, and I think it's important to register this, it's not that Ibsen is standing in front of us and lecturing us about the institution of marriage. So it has an impact on many different levels. Another point that I think is crucial about the way in which the play works, and still works, so it's still very often performed, is that Torvald, the iniquitous husband who treats Nora as a doll, as a child, is nevertheless not seen as a monster. His behaviour is exasperating at best and iniquitous at worst. but actually you are led to see in the audience how that has happened. And it's perfectly possible, indeed many productions take this line, to present Torvald in the end as almost as much a victim as Nora is of a system that constrains human potential.
Tori, what was striking, is there any overall view we can take of these last dozen or so, what could be called Ibsen's great plays? I mean, the early plays all of you will think are wonderful. For most people, they're the plays that the Wild Duck, Hedda Gabler, Ghosts, and so on and so forth. He seems to have set Master Builder. He seems to have sort of settled down. I mean, about 40, and found his patch. It's interesting the way you tell me about it.
Well, I'd like to maybe rewind just a bit and say that A Doll's House was a turning point and a shock in many ways. And how on earth could this come out of this culture? Would it have been possible anywhere else? Yes, he lived in Europe, but he was very much involved in what was happening at home. And there was the Danish critic Georg Brandes who admonished writers in Scandinavia to subject problems to debate. That was one factor. It was his rival Björnson who started writing realist plays before Ibsen, actually. And there were some more personal things that had to do with stories that he picked up about women, particularly a writer called Laura Keeler. But it was still a great surprise when this happened. And at one point he was actually considering letting this end with Nora's suicide. And I think it would have been a completely different play with a very different impact. This slamming of the door is really a key turning point in European theatre history.
Well, why? That's a big thing to say. How do you justify that?
Well, because of the impact, I mean, just in terms of reception. Of course, it started out, I think it's one of the things that meant that he could actually keep on writing these plays. Every other year, he would publish a new contemporary prose drama for the rest of his life, from Pillars of the Community in 1877 and until When We Dead Awaken in 1899. And one of the reasons anyway, was that he was an autonomous artist. At home, he had great commercial success. Even A Doll's House was played to packed houses in Copenhagen and Christiania. It sold in 10,000 copies in a culture of 4 million people. You know, so there was something, I don't think anyone but Ibsen could have done it in Scandinavia, but he certainly could. So what he did was, of course, to turn towards, as you said in your introduction, you know, towards everyday language. He rejected verse. He did say that he found writing the everyday prose, plain language, much more difficult than writing verse. And he committed himself to exploring extremely systematically, if you will, the life of the middle classes. The anomalies, the untruths, the lies, what a critic called Franco Moretti has called the grey area of bourgeois life.
Kirsten, can we just say more about Ibsen and women? We have very, memorable, to put it mildly, women, wives, daughters, mothers, and so on. Can you just ruminate about that?
Yes, I mean, one of the interesting things is here you have drama that puts the female center stage. It makes plays about women. And he is very aware. Scandinavia was very advanced in terms of awareness of women's rights. There were women's rights movements already in Scandinavian countries. And he's picking up very much on that, but he's also thinking, this is the interesting material, the bind that women are in when they're caught in institutions that are not flexible, they're not geared toward men. And the notes to a modern tragedy, as he called them, the notes to A Doll's House, which he wrote the year before he wrote the play, have often been seen as this manifesto, because in it he very simply says, there are two laws. There's legal laws under which women have to live, and they're formed by men. But more importantly, there are two spiritual conditions, and they're not compatible. Women have different spiritual laws from men. And this incompatibility and the inability of society's structures to recognize this is the bind that he explores again and again in terms of women's roles. And just to return to your question earlier about that overall scope of the plays, there are some ways of looking at the plays as he himself put it, his plays are sort of one long cycle. He thought we should read the plays in sequence as one long cycle. But within that, you can see plays almost like in pairs. So you have Peer Gynt and Brand in dialogue with each other. You have A Doll's House and Ghosts, and so on. There's almost as if he's thinking aloud in opposite ways. Once he's written one play, he rethinks and answers those questions in a new way with a new play. And it's a fascinating pattern, and it sort of keeps developing. He keeps pushing further and further as he develops.
Is he in Munich at this time? Has he gone from Rome across to Munich? Well, he spends a lot of time in Munich. Can you just give us in for a few sentences what sort of life he lives in Munich? And then let's get on with it, because I can't find anything about it.
Well, he lives the life of a Scandinavian. He goes to the Scandinavian club. He sits and reads all the Scandinavian, the Norwegian newspapers famously from one corner to the bottom corner. I mean, every single line. He's really connected to home and what's going on. And he's not... It's very difficult to trace his reading, as was said earlier.
Does he do anything? He must be doing something else besides reading Scandinavian newspapers, all is it? And writing. Is there anything in between or not? Doesn't matter all that much, yes.
I don't think he's not a well-integrated immigrant at all. He sticks pretty much to himself. Around this time, he develops these very bourgeois habits, orderliness, punctuality. He goes to a cafe at a certain point. He works, he finishes his work, he goes to another restaurant. I mean, that's the kind of... When he returns to Norway later in 1891, people were, you could observe time by looking at where Ibsen was in the city picture.
That's like Kant, isn't it? When Kant went for a walk, people knew it was time to have dinner or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Useful.
At one point with Germany, though, it has to say in Dresden, where it was first, he made a little bit more of an effort. And at one point, he did want to become a German writer. And the reason for that was another of these peculiar conditions of being a Scandinavian writer, being a dependent in many ways. William Archer said that there was never such a great writer who was so dependent on translation. And he was not protected, so he was up for grabs, basically, so the Germans could publish his works for free.
Just to return to women for a moment, I think that one thing worth adding to what Kirsten has said, that his women are not idealised. They're not all versions of an oppressed figure struggling to be free. They are fully realised human beings, and sometimes, indeed, very destructive human beings. So for instance, the Master Builder, Hilda, who is a character who appears in...
destructive human being.
Yeah. She appears in two plays. There's that kind of continuity. Yeah. Again, that point about the plays really referring to each other, because she'd been part of The Lady from the Sea. And she is wantonly destructive. So it's not that we have a simple kind of binary model of wicked, oppressive men and, as it were, virtuous, oppressed women. And I think that's one of the things that makes his Ibsen so durable, that the characters do have that moral and intellectual complexity throughout those late plays.
Yes.
Yeah, also, I think it's important to note that he shifts the interest from the kind of young ingenue figure, innocent maiden of, let's say, melodrama or other forms, to sexually mature women, for one thing. These are women who've had children. These are mothers. These are very interesting women to him in that they are older, very often, but there are some exceptions, like Hilda, who's about 18 or so, and Hedvig in The Wild Duck, who's 13. But these really stand out because his real interest is in what's going on in the mind of a married woman, a woman who's already in her 30s, Hedda Gabler, for instance, and that carries on. So he's constantly, in a way, exploring the psychology of the female psyche.
Again, I'm not probing here because I want to talk about the play. But was he married at that time?
Yes. Oh, yes. He had a happy marriage. He referred to his wife as the bridge of my thought in one poem.
That'll do.
Yeah.
Right. Can we talk about ghosts, please, Tora? And take up what's been said about women, if you wish. Because that had a tremendous, I saw a fantastic production a few years ago here. But it had a tremendous effect on the audience. Why don't you talk about it? Tell people what it's about and then say why it was such a sensation.
Well, it's even more so than A Doll's House. I suppose it's a confrontation with bourgeois institutions. And what Ibsen is really asking is, what would have happened if Nora had stayed, if she'd chosen not to leave? And this is really Mrs. Alving's fate, and this is what's being unrolled.
Mrs. Alving is?
It's the lead female character here, who is living a lonely life out on an estate by a fjord, and her son returns from Paris, and then the past is being unravelled in a typically Ibsenian fashion. We often refer to it as the retrospective technique, that very little happens apart from the fact that the past is sort of brought to life. Ghosts in Norwegian is gjenganger. It means
can we just tell people who don't know? He has syphilis and then develop from there. Yeah.
It turns out that the son has syphilis, and that leads to the questioning of his relationship with father, and mistakenly Ibsen believes that syphilis is transferred from father to son. But generally, if you will, it really is about the sins of the fathers being transferred, the past, the inheritance of traditions and the past burdening people down, and that is really what's being displayed, and this woman who is trapped in these circumstances.
Yes, and also there's a servant there who is the illegitimate, who we don't. It's a terrifying revelation at the end. And
so that is, a moment of sort of incest.
Not terrifying, but you just think, what a wasted life for someone not telling her the truth. It's about people not telling the. Well, it's always about people not telling the truth, isn't it? Really?
It is, but then what it does. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to run away from Ghost, but then what he does when he has moved on to An Enemy of the People and then The Wild Duck is that he turns the lens, and he says, he asks, so what happens if you tell the truth? So The Wild Duck is really about the terrible consequences of telling the truth. And that's typical of Ibsen, this dialectical
just
movement.
Like the terrible consequences of being a saint. Diana, you want to come in?
One of the really powerful things about Ibsen is that alongside those recurrent themes of the past that returns, the way in which the lies we tell ourselves and each other destroy us, exist alongside such a varied theatrical oeuvre. It's tempting to think that those 12 plays are somehow all reflecting each other, echoes of each other. But in fact, every one of those 12 plays is very distinct and different. So if you think of Ghosts and A Doll's House, as Dot rightly saying, they are in a way almost like two versions of a theme, but they're radically different. Ghosts is a much bleaker play, a more hopeless play. Nora slams the door, but there is some sense that it might open again. There is no sense of openings in Ghosts, and there is a pathos about Ghosts. The doomed son, Oswald, the sense in which Mrs. Alvin's life has been a lie, an act of hypocrisy from the first. Although she's a very sympathetic character, it's a harder play to watch, I think, than A Doll's House. Each of the plays is different.
Actually, in Ghosts, you find that ordinary language takes on great significance. You have, it's not just about speaking truth, but it's about speaking at all if you're a woman. So Mrs. Alving, if you look at the dialogue and the stage directions, over and over, she says the word talk, discuss, say, I want to speak. It's all about articulation of her own newly found voice and ideas. And that's something he really emphasizes in the dialogue of the play.
You mentioned the stage direction. I read Ibsen long before I saw him, and because you get booked for 6 months each when I was at university, and raced through as if they were novels, because the stage directions were so long. You read the thing, and that is how they were very much received at the beginning, as I understand it, weren't they? People bought them and read them, often went to the theatre with them on their knees.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got here the idea of the book and the theatrical production going hand in hand. I mean, Ibsen was a really savvy writer, and he actually had the support of a publisher from 1865, I think, till his death. The same publisher who they were very, very sophisticated in their techniques for getting the books out and keeping a secret all of the the plots.
I know we're hopping from one play to another, but you can do it. Wild Duck is often thought by some, although it's not the most popular by a long way, as most significant play. I think you're one of the upholders of that notion, are you?
I'm not sure. I love the play. I do. But it's. I think it's sort of. I looked up the sort of the frequency of the productions, and it's probably number 6 or something in among the plays. But again, I would want to say that again, it's an example of how Ibsen is able to reinvent himself. So you've had 3 plays that they're enough to make him the father of modern drama. Really, he becomes the realist.
This is The Doll's House, Ghosts,
and An Enemy of the People.
Yeah, Enemy of the People.
And then, on one level, okay, so with Dr. Stockman in An Enemy of the People, we have seen the truth serve, being on his own against the masses. And in some ways it's a sympathetic portrait, but anyway. And then he turns the lens. And in The Wild Duck, you have Gregor Svelda, who comes into this family situation and sees hypocrisy, sees lies, and wants to confront them. And there's a famous line in this play by the cynic, Dr. Relling. If you take the lifeline away from an average human being, you take away his happiness. And this is what happens to Hjalmar Ekdal, and it ends in tragedy. I think the play as such is a tragic comedy, and we haven't talked about that, but there is a comic streak in Ibsen as well. Although I suppose what it did was to create middle-class tragedy. There is this comic streak as well. He did say, watching the play in Copenhagen, that if you don't play this as a tragic comedy, it's impossible to understand Hedvig's death.
For all the comic strands, and I think they are very active in that play, and I think it's an enormously powerful play. I think there is quite a simple reason for it not being so popular on stage, and that is the death, the suicide of Hedvig, who is a young teenager. It's a very, very painful issue. And although it's true to say that these are domestic dramas, all of the sets are in houses, middle-class domestic life, there is, among the ghosts that haunt them, the constant threat of violence and violent death. There are shocking deaths in Ibsen's drama. They play very different parts in the dramatic dynamic, not all the same kind of death. But that's one of the reasons, I think, that he has had this persistent presence, that there is this tension between a bourgeois domestic drama and always the threat of an imminent explosion and destruction. Hedda Gabler, of course, most famously in The Death of Hedda, which continues to pack a punch. It's a very, very shocking moment.
Yes, and just to say, he not only attacks marriage as an institution, but he's really interested in alternatives to the vice-like grip of the biological nuclear family. So he's constantly showing families in different configurations of families, especially step-parents and step-children, like in The Wild Duck, that are actually perfectly happy. And it's the families that are biologically tied that often are revealed to be really rotten at their core and living in a kind of hypocritical, stifled way.
You're going to have to unravel that a bit. You said they're perfectly happy and then they're living in a rotten way.
So Hjalmar, in The Wild Duck, Hjalmar Ekdal has a lovely relationship with his daughter Hedvig, who is not biologically related to him. And when he finds out that they're not related, when they both realize this, that's when the unhappiness sets in. It's too much for him to bear, but it shouldn't have made any difference because the actual bond between them is so strong. So it's a question of Ibsen getting right to the core of what is the nature of the real bond between parents and children, and for that matter, any relationships of any meaning at all in life. That's really what he's interested in.
Sorry.
I'll just say that there's another change that happens with The Wild Duck, and it's that while the earlier heroines, if you will, had been able to realize their condition, they may not have been able to do so much. Nora does something about it. Mrs. Alving can't do anything about it. They're trapped. You move on to new heroines who they've been called inarticulate poets of living. So they don't even realize what it is that's driving them and how they've been trapped in this condition, which is true also of Hedda Gabler and Matilda, as we mentioned, and The Lady from the Sea. And there is this turn in late Ibsen, from A Wild Duck onwards, where the plays become more difficult, more inward-looking. They create a new mythology in themselves.
Ibsen never has any time for a rigid ideological solution to these challenges. He's not a man who sets plays before us that says, here is the problem, the great bourgeois problem, and I, Ibsen, have the solutions. They're very dynamic, they're very open-ended. And that's another reason for their popularity on stage, because there is so much room for different performances, different approaches to the roles. But I do think it's important to realise that not all of Ibsen's dramas are so unremittingly bleak. The Lady from the Sea, for instance, returns to the theme of a woman trapped in a marriage, but in that instance it's almost like an optimistic rewriting of A Doll's House. It's a wonderful play. She works her way through to a situation in which her husband fully realises her claims as an independent, free human being, gives her that choice to be free, and she chooses him. She chooses to return and rebuild the marriage on a different basis. So they're not all pessimistic, dark and ending in disaster.
Kirsten, did his concentration on women have an impact at the time to other playwrights, other writers and so on?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Can you give us a little notion of that?
Yes, I mean, Oscar Wilde, for instance, very much picks up on Ibsen and follows what Ibsen's doing. Henry James is a great fan of Ibsen. I'm only looking here at the Anglophone, the British. But more importantly, I think even than other writers, in one way of looking at it is what he did for the actress. So you have a great example in Elizabeth Robbins, an actress who, along with a friend, Marion Lee, they pawned their jewelry so they could form a theatre company so they could perform Ibsen. And the first production was Hedda Gabler, and she played Hedda. And she actually made Ibsen fashionable because she spent lots of money on costumes. And Ibsen, until that point in London, had been rather kind of dingy and low budget. And she really made Ibsen, she put Ibsen on the map in terms of a bit of glamour.
I think that's a turning point. So Ghost was the scandal. There were 500 articles written about ghosts in London. It was a huge scandal. Then with Hedda Gabler, it becomes fashionable somehow. She is the pas de siècle woman. And people like Oscar Wilde will write letters saying, come with vine leaves in your hair, which is a line from the play. People don't do such things, which is another line. So there was a movement there, and then surprisingly quickly, Ibsen became canonized, I'll say. Huge debates, culture wars, and then in the latter part of the 90s, he was part of the canon. Sorry, Diana, I think we're out of time. Unfortunately, thank you all very much indeed, Tori Rem, Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, and you, Diana Birch. Next week we'll be discussing Persepolis, the ceremonial city of the Persians, founded by Darius the Great and destroyed by Alexander. How about that? Thanks for listening.
And the In Our Time podcast gets some extra time now with a few minutes of bonus material from Melvin and his guests.
The Wizard's class, isn't it?
Oh, we didn't even get to his legacy.
No, I saw the word legacy, but I saw the thing 20 seconds. I think we start on the legacy and we'll disrupt the whole Radio 4 schedule.
Maybe we can do the legacy for the podcast.
Do the legacy now.
I mean, there are two things, I think, about the legacy. First is Ibsen's seriousness, by which I don't mean gloom. The way in which his drama really confronted with great courage, great intellectual courage, big ideas, didn't flinch from their consequences. Thomas Hardy, for instance, not a dramatist, so he's very interested in the theatre, was influenced by Ibsen in that sense. I think his influence and his legacy extends beyond theatre. But in theatre, one of the many things we didn't really have time to talk about is his influence on theatrical form, the way in which plays work, the way in which he uses dialogue, I think, which, as Tori rightly says, is very challenging, found it very hard, but is brilliantly crafted.
Yeah, he basically, even as realism is coming in, and it's revolutionary at the time. We often forget realism was revolutionary at the time, even though it then got a bad name for being, too rigid and boring and just in an imitation. But actually, he right away spotted that it's a dynamic form, and he injected a bit of meta-theatricality, so that idea that there's a self-aware sense that people are performing and assessing themselves as you said with Nora, wearing a mask and announcing, I'm going to take my mask off. So there's that dynamic sense that realism is in a work in progress, and he's part of making it into something that's malleable and flexible and
I think part of that is not just well, it is also the fact that he dares to confront this material, the dark side of bourgeois existence. Henry James says he has cleared the air we breathe. So there's an opening up for art, I think, is one of the things he does, is actually opening up the territory of art. And I do think another more perhaps boring sort of book historical point, which you touched on, Melvin, was the relationship between the book and the stage. He came from a culture when there was a close relationship between book and stage. In England, that had been gone for 50 years. So you didn't actually publish contemporary plays.
What you didn't have in Norway, as I understand it, was a triumph of the novel, which really happened in England in a big way.
Absolutely. So that meant that it was perfectly legitimate for him to start writing the drama. Whereas in England, the best writers would go for the novel.
The other thing, thinking about his reception, impact, legacy, the scandal, which was extraordinary, the scandal around ghosts, so forth, not necessarily a bad thing for a playwright's success. No, people do like scandal, then as now.
You're not suggesting that he aimed to scandalise the audience to get them to come?
I think he knew that ghosts would have a very profound and shocking impact, and he didn't flinch from that because it was a matter of ideas. But I do think he was quite a canny man, Ibsen, alongside his devotion to an aesthetic. He knew it would do him no harm, and he was right. He didn't.
You talked about moving boundary posts. That's what he wanted to do, and I think that in some ways Ghosts is an exception because the audience actually couldn't take it. So he went too far. Then he pulled back a bit with An Enemy of the People. He actually wrote to his publisher saying, this time the merchants can see it. Well, so there is that dynamic as well.
In London it was censored, and so the way they got rounded by it is they formed a club, and you joined the club, and if you joined the club you could go to the play.
There was a loophole in the censorship laws that they exploited.
But is there any better way of making your drama seem really exciting and glamorous than to say, you can't see, it's too shocking?
At the same time, it's interesting with Legacy how he did pick, I suppose, universal, relevant themes that we still are worrying about. I mean, they haven't gone away. As you said, it's still a shock when you see the wife, the mother leave her children. But also An Enemy of the People is a good example, isn't it? Because you've got now climate change speaking incredibly strongly, the play speaks strongly to that, even though at the time it was you might have written it off as a topical play about some remote town with problems of pollution in its waters. But you've always got the tanneries off stage. He never shows you them, but you've got that looming presence of the pollution. The source of it is there. And so he's aware of that. And I think even as a child, he remembers hearing the sound of the mills, the sawmills. And so we don't have much in the way of autobiography from him, but he remembers that. So there's a kind of awareness of industry and its effects that's very modern.
Yeah, and money. He's very sharp. We didn't talk about money, but actually Ibsen is deeply interested in his own life, but certainly in the drama, in money and effects of money. But I think, it's a point we keep making, but I think it's so crucial. One of the reasons that Legacy has been so enduring is that the plays are so stageable. You don't have to be an immensely sophisticated, high-powered theatrical company to put on an effective performance of A Doll's House or Hedda Gabler, because the play does the work for you. They're so brilliantly constructed.
Can we talk a little bit more about, just before the producer comes in, can you tell us a little bit more about what you see as his legacy? I mean, does it go down to Bergman and all the rest of it? Is that what we're talking about?
Does it go, sorry?
To Bergman and so on. Does it go into films?
Oh, yes. I mean, there are, 200 films made of Ibsen, so...
It's not just films made, it's a cast of mind that he encouraged, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's probably better for sort of TV drama than it is for films, actually. I don't see many successful
and other
Ibsen
playwrights,
films.
Arthur Miller,
And of course, lots of other playwrights, and not least in the American tradition.
Yeah, that's right.
Bergman
very
is another
important.
example. But
Eugene O'Neill, I think, is hugely influenced by him.
But I'm sort of intrigued by the fact that, you know, I look upon him, reading him in the original, as I happen to do, you know, look upon him as an extremely precise, tight, taut writer. Nothing is left to chance, certainly not in the last 12 plays. And then at the same time, there must be a kind of amazing openness about them, because they can be used for any purpose, you know. So around the world, it's played in China today.
That's right, 'cause the characters
whatever.
He was lucky. He wanted to have a global language, and he was lucky with his English translators. He was taken on very strongly by devoted English literary folk.
Very striking
Knew
that Arthur actually did faithful translations. He was ridiculed for it. You know, he's translated Ibsen word by word. I mean, that was unheard of because domestication.
It's brilliant combination.
And it is that balance, isn't it, between that precision, that care, and the dynamic open-endedness that gives room for interpretations.
I'm talking about the dynamic open-dooredness as the producer's coming in.
Gosh, coffee is always welcome.
Yeah, coffee, I think, it's very good.
In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg is produced by Simon Tillotson.
And there's lots more where that particular podcast came from, so why not download the News Quiz as part of the Friday Night Comedy podcast? You can find it wherever you found this.
Take the stage in a doll's house and bring the powerful drama to life. First is the protagonist, Nora Helmer. Nora is the cheerful wife of Torvald Helmer and the mother of their 3 children. She takes small jobs and scrounges money from Torvald to pay back a secret loan she took without her proud husband's consent or knowledge for a trip his doctor said would save his life. But this secret financial burden wears on her, causing resentment, a desire to be respected by her husband, and freedom from the limitations society places on her because she's a woman. But Nora's faith in her husband's superior morality unravels over the course of the play. When he maligns her in response to the possibility that she'll hurt his reputation, but then quickly restores it, Nora realizes their marriage is a sham. She leaves Torvald, intent on discovering who she really is and what she really believes in. Torvald Helmer is the condescending, traditionally patriarchal husband of Nora. He feels it's his duty to provide a moral reality for his wife, including instructing her on how she should think, feel, behave, and act. He believes she needs constant guidance because she's intellectually inferior and childish, but all the while, he delights in her beauty. Torvald resents Nora's deceased father for what he sees as negative character traits his wife has inherited, without realizing that he is similar to the man he criticizes. When Nora's secret is revealed, his ugliness and narrow perspective rise to the surface. As Nora leaves, he is left adrift in confusion and despair. Krogstad is trying to regain his reputation in an unforgiving society after being caught and ruined for a crime he committed in the past through employment in a bank where Torvald is the manager. His desperation drives him to blackmail Nora. It is Christine offering him a second chance that saves him. It turns out he isn't motivated by money or desire to win respect from society. Rather, he needs love, understanding, and honesty. These things Christine offers end up redeeming him. Christine, lonely and tired, arrives on Nora's doorstep, essentially in search of a reason to live. Having chosen money over love in her marriage, she now finds herself without means or family life. She tries to steer her friend Nora from making bad choices and losing all she has, wishing for Nora to have a future based on honesty or understanding. Christine drives Nora's revelation that she must seek self-awareness and independence and reverses her own misfortune, finding love, purpose, and a second chance. Dr. Rank, a close friend of Nora and Torvald, diagnoses physical conditions and moral ailments of those around him. Like Torvald, he believes that morality or immorality is inherited both physically, nature, and through upbringing, nurture. But Dr. Rank ultimately turns out to contrast Torvald's self-delusion of moral superiority. Dr. Rank sees reality. He faces his impending death and admits his feelings to Nora, making Torvald the only character in the play who remains clueless about his true nature. Key themes like sexism, the individual versus society, self-awareness, and honesty contribute to the lasting resonance of the incredible play, A Doll's House. Sexism flows beneath Nora and Torvald's relationship, one based on stereotypes. Their roles in the marriage are defined by what men and women are supposed to do, rather than what might work for the couple as individuals. Torvald represents the belief that women should accept a lesser status and value than men. Nora represents the masses of women who have given up their unique identities in order to conform to societal stereotypes. And these roles are just as false, unfulfilling, and unsustainable as the limiting men's beliefs that created them. Near the end of the play, Torvald reveals the low regard he has for women. Incapable of seeing Nora as her own person with her own thoughts, wants, needs, Nora knows she has no choice except to leave Torvald and her sexist marriage in order to find herself. The theme of individual versus society comes up often, especially when Krogstad brings up the central question of whether a person can truly be an individual within the boundaries of society. To be an individual means to reject or ignore social norms. However, characters surrounding Nora suggest that complete exclusion from society is impossible. Krogstad has committed the same crime as Nora. Christine has achieved the independence Nora longs for in the beginning of the play. But both have paid a heavy price. Parallels between Nora and these characters who have lived outside of society's expectations anchors Nora's defiance of society itself. The theme of self-awareness unfolds throughout Nora's journey. At the beginning of the play, Nora is unaware that she lacks self-awareness. But as the play unfolds, she gains a sense of this as she matches her intellectual, moral, and emotional viewpoints to those of her husband and father. The horror of the thought of herself as being unworthy or harmful to her children forces Nora to see the consequences of her actions at the end of Act 2, and she withdraws incrementally from her children throughout the rest of the play. Dr. Rank also represents this theme, both in his ability to see that his death is nigh and to admit to Nora that he's in love with her. He stands in stark contrast to his friend Torvald, who exposes himself as a hypocrite and an unaware man. Honesty is another theme in the play, as you cannot know yourself or have a healthy relationship without it. The more Nora lies and hides from the truth, the more confused she becomes. But Christine serves to unravel the lies told to Torvald and the deeper lies of Nora's self-deception. Christine's telling Krogstad to leave the letter, that Torvald must read it, makes the truth inescapable for Nora. With the exposure comes the opportunity to take her flight to freedom. The old adage, the truth shall set you free, rings particularly true by the end of the play. Money, the tarantella dance, and birds are the emblematic ornamental symbols at play in A Doll's House. Money symbolizes men's control over women, who are not allowed equal access to it. The play begins with Nora coquettishly asking Torvald for money and ends with her refusing to take any belongings from his house except those she owned before they met, earning a symbolic kind of freedom when she refuses her husband's financial help as she sets out to find herself. In fact, the entire plot of the play is driven by Nora's taking money in secret from Krogstad. Christine, in direct contrast to Nora, has means to make money, which gives her the power to make her own choices. The tarantella is an Italian folk dance based on the frenzied movements victims make to draw out the poison after being bitten by a spider. Nora's wild performance of this dance symbolizes the pretense Torvald and Nora have set in the play as the staple of their relationship. He instructs, she performs. He criticizes, and she dances faster to please. That doesn't please him either. When Nora rehearses the tarantella, she dances with wild abandon. She's trying to please, but she's also actually frantic, perhaps to remove the poison of corruption Torvald has suggested she possesses when he refers to Krogstad's lack of character. Birds are also symbols that show up often. When Nora is happy in the way Torvald likes and expects, he calls her his skylark or songbird. When she's frightened, she is his dove. When she's unhappy, Torvald scolds Nora, referring to her in terms of birds, such as a songbird must have a clean beak. Birds represent Torvald's view of Nora as a fragile, light creature meant to entertain and delight him, but one he must also protect. They also represent Nora's flight to freedom, as she's like a bird in a cage, singing for her keep in the beginning of the play, but escaping her cage circumstances by the end. In the introduction of the play A Doll's House, Nora Helmer, a young, happy wife and mother of 3, enters her home, followed by a porter toting a Christmas tree. Her husband, Torvald, calls out to her from his office. He believes his wife is wasteful with money and teases Nora for spending too much. In the rising action, Nora shows Torvald her presents and requests money for her own Christmas present. Torvald gives it, but has no idea Nora needs money for a loan she borrowed without his consent that she's been working in secret to pay back her lender. Christine, a childhood friend of Nora's, drops by, and the two women discuss how their lives have changed since they last saw each other. Nora brags about Torvald's new position at the bank and offers to convince him to hire Christine. Nora then describes how she saved Torvald's life early in their marriage by providing the money they needed to spend a year in Italy. But the loan's lender, Krogstad, soon arrives to meet with Torvald. Dr. Rank, a close friend of Torvald and Nora, comes in and gossips about Krogstad's bad reputation for being caught up in a scandal years ago. Torvald meets Christine and says he's willing to give her a position at the bank where he's a manager. Krogstad slips back into the house. He thinks Torvald will replace him at the bank where he works with Christine, whom he has known from the past. Krogstad blackmails Nora, wanting her to influence Torvald to let him keep his job. When Nora refuses, Krogstad reminds her that she has committed fraud by forging her father's signature for the loan. Nora tries to persuade Torvald not to fire Krogstad, but Torvald fires Krogstad immediately instead of waiting until the new year. Nora considers asking Dr. Rank for help, but changes her mind when the doctor confesses his love for her. Krogstad decides to expose Nora and drops a letter about the loan and forgery into a locked letterbox outside of Torvald's office. Nora tells Christine that Krogstad is her moneylender. Christine rushes out to convince Krogstad to recall the letter and expresses a desire to begin a new relationship with him, even though she chose another man when they were younger. Krogstad offers to recall his letters to Torvald, but Christine tells him not to, believing honesty will bring understanding into Nora and Torvald's marriage. In the play's climax, Torvald reads Krogstad's letter, revealing the loan and forgery. In the following action, Torvald calls Nora immoral, showing his self-centeredness, and chastises her viciously. But a new letter from Krogstad arrives, saying he's forgiven the loan. Ecstatic that his reputation will not be damaged, Torvald instantly forgives Nora. Nora finally sees that her husband does not truly love or understand her. She will always be nothing more than his doll. She decides to leave her family, educate herself, and make her own way in the world. In the resolution, Torvald sinks into a chair in despair, his face buried in his hands. The play famously closes with the slamming of a door. the introduction of the play A Doll's House, Nora Helmer, a young, happy wife and mother of 3, enters her home, followed by a porter toting a Christmas tree. Her husband, Torvald, calls out to her from his office. He believes his wife is wasteful with money and teases Nora for spending too much. In the rising action, Nora shows Torvald her presents and requests money for her own Christmas present. Torvald gives it, but has no idea Nora needs money for a loan she borrowed without his consent, that she's been working in secret to pay back her lender. Christine, a childhood friend of Nora's, drops by, and the two women discuss how their lives have changed since they last saw each other. Nora brags about Torvald's new position at the bank and offers to convince him to hire Christine. Nora then describes how she saved Torvald's life early in their marriage by providing the money they needed to spend a year in Italy. But the loan's lender, Krogstad, soon arrives to meet with Torvald. Dr. Rank, a close friend of Torvald and Nora, comes in and gossips about Krogstad's bad reputation for being caught up in a scandal years ago. Torvald meets Christine and says he's willing to give her a position at the bank where he's a manager. Krogstad slips back into the house. He thinks Torvald will replace him at the bank where he works with Christine, whom he has known from the past. Krogstad blackmails Nora, wanting her to influence Torvald to let him keep his job. When Nora refuses, Krogstad reminds her that she has committed fraud by forging her father's signature for the loan. Nora tries to persuade Torvald not to fire Krogstad, but Torvald fires Krogstad immediately instead of waiting until the new year. Nora considers asking Dr. Rank for help, but changes her mind when the doctor confesses his love for her. Krogstad decides to expose Nora and drops a letter about the loan and forgery into a locked letterbox outside of Torvald's office. Nora tells Christine that Krogstad is her moneylender. Christine rushes out to convince Krogstad to recall the letter and expresses a desire to begin a new relationship with him, even though she chose another man when they were younger. Krogstad offers to recall his letters to Torvald, but Christine tells him not to, believing honesty will bring understanding into Nora and Torvald's marriage. In the play's climax, Torvald reads Krogstad's letter, revealing the loan and forgery. In the following action, Torvald calls Nora immoral, showing his self-centeredness, and chastises her viciously. But a new letter from Krogstad arrives, saying he's forgiven the loan. Ecstatic that his reputation will not be damaged, Torvald instantly forgives Nora. Nora finally sees that her husband does not truly love or understand her. She will always be nothing more than his doll. She decides to leave her family, educate herself, and make her own way in the world. In the resolution, Torvald sinks into a chair in despair, his face buried in his hands. The play famously closes with the slamming of a door. 5 key characters take the stage in A Doll's House and bring the powerful drama to life. First is the protagonist, Nora Helmer. Nora is the cheerful wife of Torvald Helmer and the mother of their 3 children. She takes small jobs and scrounges money from Torvald to pay back a secret loan she took without her proud husband's consent or knowledge, for a trip his doctor said would save his life. But this secret financial burden wears on her, causing resentment, a desire to be respected by her husband, and freedom from the limitations society places on her because she's a woman. But Nora's faith in her husband's superior morality unravels over the course of the play. When he maligns her in response to the possibility that she'll hurt his reputation, but then quickly restores it, Nora realizes their marriage is a sham. She leaves Torvald, intent on discovering who she really is and what she really believes in. Torvald Helmer is the condescending, traditionally patriarchal husband of Nora. He feels it's his duty to provide a moral reality for his wife, including instructing her on how she should think, feel, behave, and act. He believes she needs constant guidance because she's intellectually inferior and childish, but all the while, he delights in her beauty. Torvald resents Nora's deceased father for what he sees as negative character traits his wife has inherited, without realizing that he is similar to the man he criticizes. When Nora's secret is revealed, his ugliness and narrow perspective rise to the surface. As Nora leaves, he is left adrift in confusion and despair. Krogstad is trying to regain his reputation in an unforgiving society after being caught and ruined for a crime he committed in the past through employment in a bank where Torvald is the manager. His desperation drives him to blackmail Nora. It is Christine offering him a second chance that saves him. It turns out he isn't motivated by money or desire to win respect from society. Rather, he needs love, understanding, and honesty. These things Christine offers end up redeeming him. Christine, lonely and tired, arrives on Nora's doorstep essentially in search of a reason to live. Having chosen money over love in her marriage, she now finds herself without means or family life. She tries to steer her friend Nora from making bad choices and losing all she has, wishing for Nora to have a future based on honesty or understanding. Christine drives Nora's revelation that she must seek self-awareness and independence and reverses her own misfortune, finding love, purpose, and a second chance. Dr. Rank, a close friend of Nora and Torvald, diagnoses physical conditions and moral ailments of those around him. Like Torvald, he believes that morality or immorality is inherited both physically, nature, and through upbringing, nurture. But Dr. Rank ultimately turns out to contrast Torvald's self-delusion of moral superiority. Dr. Rank sees reality. He faces his impending death and admits his feelings to Nora, making Torvald the only character in the play who remains clueless about his true nature. Money, the tarantella dance, and birds are the emblematic ornamental symbols at play in A Doll's House. Money symbolizes men's control over women, who are not allowed equal access to it. The play begins with Nora coquettishly asking Torvald for money and ends with her refusing to take any belongings from his house except those she owned before they met, earning a symbolic kind of freedom when she refuses her husband's financial help as she sets out to find herself. In fact, the entire plot of the play is driven by Nora's taking money in secret from Krogstad. Christine, in direct contrast to Nora, has means to make money, which gives her the power to make her own choices. The tarantella is an Italian folk dance based on the frenzied movements victims make to draw out the poison after being bitten by a spider. Nora's wild performance of this dance symbolizes the pretense Torvald and Nora have set in the play as the staple of their relationship. He instructs, she performs. He criticizes, and she dances faster to please, but that doesn't please him either. When Nora rehearses the tarantella, she dances with wild abandon. She's trying to please, but she's also actually frantic, perhaps to remove the poison of corruption Torvald has suggested she possesses when he refers to Krogstad's lack of character. Birds are also symbols that show up often. When Nora is happy in the way Torvald likes and expects, he calls her his skylark or songbird. When she's frightened, she is his dove. When she's unhappy, Torvald scolds Nora, referring to her in terms of birds, such as a songbird must have a clean beak. Birds represent Torvald's view of Nora as a fragile, light creature meant to entertain and delight him, but one he must also protect. They also represent Nora's flight to freedom, as she's like a bird in a cage, singing for her keep in the beginning of the play, but escaping her caged circumstances by the end. Key themes like sexism, the individual versus society, self-awareness, and honesty contribute to the lasting resonance of the incredible play, A Doll's House. Sexism flows beneath Nora and Torvald's relationship, one based on stereotypes. Their roles in the marriage are defined by what men and women are supposed to do, rather than what might work for the couple as individuals. Torvald represents the belief that women should accept a lesser status and value than men. Nora represents the masses of women who have given up their unique identities in order to conform to societal stereotypes. And these roles are just as false, unfulfilling, and unsustainable as the limiting men's beliefs that created them. Near the end of the play, Torvald reveals the low regard he has for women. Incapable of seeing Nora as her own person with her own thoughts, wants, needs, Nora knows she has no choice except to leave Torvald and her sexist marriage in order to find herself. The theme of individual versus society comes up often, especially when Krogstad brings up the central question of whether a person can truly be an individual within the boundaries of society. To be an individual means to reject or ignore social norms. However, characters surrounding Nora suggest that complete exclusion from society is impossible. Krogstad has committed the same crime as Nora. Christine has achieved the independence Nora longs for in the beginning of the play. But both have paid a heavy price. Parallels between Nora and these characters who have lived outside of society's expectations anchors Nora's defiance of society itself. The theme of self-awareness unfolds throughout Nora's journey. At the beginning of the play, Nora is unaware that she lacks self-awareness. But as the play unfolds, she gains a sense of this as she matches her intellectual, moral, and emotional viewpoint to those of her husband and father. The horror of the thought of herself as being unworthy or harmful to her children forces Nora to see the consequences of her actions at the end of Act 2, and she withdraws incrementally from her children throughout the rest of the play. Dr. Rank also represents this theme, both in his ability to see that his death is nigh and to admit to Nora that he's in love with her. He stands in stark contrast to his friend Torvald, who exposes himself as a hypocrite and an unaware man. Honesty is another theme in the play, as you cannot know yourself or have a healthy relationship without it. The more Nora lies and hides from the truth, the more confused she becomes. But Christine serves to unravel the lies told to Torvald and the deeper lies of Nora's self-deception. Christine's telling Krogstad to leave the letter, that Torvald must read it, makes the truth inescapable for Nora. With the exposure comes the opportunity to take her flight to freedom. The old adage, the truth shall set you free, rings particularly true by the end of the play.